You will stand where you are without moving until you can tell me what you mean by stuff. His father laid down his glasses and settled back in his chair to underscore the fact that he was prepared to wait all day if need be. Chrysalids and dirt and sticks and food for them, the boy mumbled. The man stared at Denny as if he were an animal he had at bay. You intend to put that filth into that jar? Denny made no answer. His father continued. Are you by any chance aware that that jar was a gift from the Maharaja of Udaipur? Have you any faintest conception of its intrinsic value aside from the sentimental one? And can you see from where you stand that beside any other objection I might have, the jar is being employed for what it was intended for? And if for one moment you think I am going to remove my best tobacco from my best jar so that you can use it for a worm bowl, you are, my lad, very much mistaken. The man waited for the effect of his speech and then added, Go and ask Ethel for a crock. It was useless for Denny to attempt to explain. They wouldn't be able to see through a crock. Without a word, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving the door open behind him. His father called him back, but he paid no attention. As he reached the second landing, Denny heard the door slam downstairs. A half hour had been wasted, and, as he had been sure it would, the moth, having gained control over itself, was in the first strugglings of flight. There was only one thing to do. Denny was at the corner where he kept his equipment. Returning, he lifted the lid from the lamp chimney, and reaching inside with his forceps, he clenched the moth with a certain brutality, though he took pains to avoid injury to its wings. Lifting it out, the beauty of so few hours, Denny once again felt his omnipotence. Without hesitation, he plunged the moth into the cyanide jar and screwed down the lid. The wings beat frantically with the effort that should have carried the moth on its first flight through the spring air. Breathless, Denny watched for fear the wings would be injured. The dusty abdomen throbbed faster and faster. The antennae twitched from side to side. With a spasm, the abdomen formed a curve to meet the thorax. The eyes, still bearing the unenlightened gaze of birth, turned suddenly into the unknowing glaze of death. But in the moment that they turned, Denny thought he saw his distorted image gleaming on their black china surfaces, as if in that instant the moth had stored his image in its memory. Denny unscrewed the cap, plucked out the moth, and piercing its body with a pin from the black paper packet, he pinned the moth to the wall at the foot of his bed. He gave it a place of honor, centering it upon a yellow willow tree. From his bed he would see it first thing in the morning and last thing at night. A few days and nights passed, and Denny, though still on edge, felt somewhat as a hero must returning from a labor. The untimely death of the moth had perhaps been fortuitous, because now in its death the creature was irrevocably his. The meadow was already filled with cabbage butterflies, and Denny would go out with his net and catch them, but they were too common to preserve, and so, having captured them, he would reach his hand into the net and squash them, wiping the mess in his palm on the grass. It was less than a week after the death of the moth when Denny was awakened at night by a persistent beating on his window pane. He jumped from bed, switched on the light, and peered outside. With the light on, he could see nothing, and whatever it had been was gone. Realizing that though the light made anything outside invisible to him, it would also act like a lure to whatever had tried to come in, he went back to bed, leaving the light on and the window open. He tried to stay awake, but soon fell back asleep. In the morning he looked about the room, but there was no sign of anything having entered. It must have been a June bug, or possibly a lunar moth, though it had sounded too heavy for one, thought Denny. He went over to look at the moth on the wall, a morning ritual with him. Although he could not be sure, the dust of one wing seemed to be smudged, and the oily stain from the body had soaked into the wallpaper considerably since the night before. He put his face close to the insect to inspect it more fully. Instinctively he drew back. The odor was unbearable. The following night Denny left his window open, and shortly before midnight he was awakened by a beating of wings upon his face. Terrified and not fully conscious, he hit out with his open hands and touched something, and it wasn't pleasant. It was yielding at the same time, viscid, and something scratched against the palm of his hand like a tiny spur of a horn. Leaping from bed, Denny switched on the light. There was nothing in the room. It must have been a bat, and the distasteful thought made him shudder. Whatever it had been, it left a stench behind, not unlike the stench of the spot on the wall. Denny slammed the window shut and went back to bed and tried to sleep. In the morning, his red-rimmed eyes, inspecting the moth, plainly saw that not only were the wings smudged, but that the simulacra of crabs and mouths upon the wings seemed to have grown more definite. The oily spot had spread still farther, and the smell was stronger. That night Denny slept with his window closed, but in his dreams he was beset by horned and squashy things that pounded his flesh with their fragile wings, and awakening in fright he heard the same sound as he had heard the previous night. Something beating against the window pane. All night it beat against the closed window, and Denny lay rigid and sleepless in his bed, and the smell within the room grew into something almost tangible. At dawn, Denny arose and forced himself to look at the moth. He held his nose as he did so, and with horror he saw the stain on the paper and the crabs, and the mouths, which not only seemed more definite, but also considerably enlarged. For the first time in months, Denny left his room and did not return until it was his bedtime. Even that hour he contrived to postpone a little by asking his father to read to him. It was the lesser of two evils. The stench in the room was such that although Denny dared not leave the window open, he was forced to leave the door from the landing into his room ajar. What was left of the light in the hall below, after it had wormed its way up and around the stairs, crawled exhaustedly into the room. For some perverse reason it shone more brightly upon the wall where the moth was transfixed. From his bed, Denny could not take his eyes off it. Though they made no progress, the two crabs on the hind wings appeared to be attempting to climb up into the two mouths on the four wings. The mouths seemed to be very open and ready for them. That night, no sooner had the beating of wings upon the window awakened Denny than it abruptly ceased. The light downstairs was out, and the room was now in darkness. Curling himself into a ball and pulling the sheet over his head, Denny at length went off to sleep. Some time shortly afterward, something came through the door and half crawled and half fluttered to the bed. Denny awoke with a scream, but it was too muffled for either his father or Ethel to hear, because what caused him to scream had wormed its way beneath the sheet and was resting like a sticky pulp upon Denny's mouth. Floundering like a drowning person, the boy threw back the covers and managed to dislodge whatever had been upon his mouth. When he dared to, he reached out and turned on the light. There was nothing in the room, but upon his sheets there were smudges of glistening dust, almost black, almost purple, almost green, but not quite any of them. Denny went down to breakfast without looking at the moth. "No wonder you look ghastly," his father said to him. "If the smell in this house is half of what it must be in your room, it's a wonder you're not suffocated. What are you running up there? A potter's field for Lepidoptera? I'll give you until noon to get them out." All day Danny left the window of his room wide open. It was the 1st of May and the sun was bright. As a sop to his father, he brought down a box of duplicate specimens. He showed them to his father before disposing of them. "Phew," said his father. "Dump them far away from the house." That night, Denny went to bed, with both the door and window locked tight in spite of the smell. The moon was bright and shone all night, unimpaired, upon the wall. Denny could not keep his eyes off the moth. By now, both crabs and mouths were nearly as large as the wings themselves, and the crabs were moving, Denny could swear. They appeared in relief, perhaps through some trick of chiaroscuro, induced by the moonlight upon the dusty white and red markings. The claws seemed upon the verge of attacking the mouths, or were the so terribly white teeth of the mouths waiting to clamp down upon the crabs. Denny shuddered and closed his eyes. Sleep came eventually, only to be broken in upon by the beating of wings against the window pane, and no sooner had that ceased, and Denny became less rigid, than the thing was at the door, beating urgently as though it must be let in. The only relief from the tap-tapping was an occasional more solid thud against the panel of the door. It was, Denny guessed, caused by the soft and fleshy body of the thing. If he survived the night, Denny vowed, he would destroy the thing upon the wall, or better than losing it entirely, he would give it to his father, and he in turn would